In the closing days of 1944, the United States Army stood on the edge of its greatest crisis in the European theater, and almost nobody outside a handful of generals saw it coming. What you're about to hear is not a legend dressed up for the camera. It is the verified, documented story of how one Army commander turned a catastrophic German breakthrough into the most celebrated maneuver of the entire war, executed in under 72 hours, in brutal winter conditions, without waiting for the kind of permission most commanders would have demanded. This is a story about decision-making under pressure, about the difference between a man who hesitates and a man who has already done the thinking before the question is even asked, and about how that decision rippled all the way up the American chain of command to the people who would one day run the country. The tone here is serious, because the stakes were real lives, real terrain, and a real possibility that the war could have dragged on for years longer than it did. Before this story even properly begins, on December 16, 1944, the German army had just launched the single largest surprise offensive the Western Allies would face in the entire war, and it caught nearly everyone flat-footed. Through the dense, fog-choked forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg, two German panzer armies under Adolf Hitler's direct order tore into a thinly held stretch of the American front. Hitler's gamble was audacious and desperate in equal measure: split the British and American armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the west before Soviet forces could finish crushing Germany from the east. The American units holding that stretch of line were exhausted, undermanned, and spread across nearly 100 miles of rugged terrain that nobody expected to be seriously tested that winter. Whole regiments of the Green 106th Infantry Division were overrun and captured within the first 2 days, one of the worst single losses of American prisoners in the European War. Fog and heavy cloud cover grounded Allied aircraft, stripping away the air superiority that had protected American ground troops for months. The German spearheads moved fast, faster than anyone in Allied command structure had planned for, and a dangerous bulge began to form in the Allied line, a bulge that would soon give this battle its name. At the center of the German objective sat a small, unremarkable Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne, where 7 hard roads converged in the middle of dense forest, and whoever controlled those roads controlled the German army's ability to resupply and reinforce its advance. If you find this kind of real, high-stakes history compelling, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, so take a second right now to subscribe and tap that like button, because it genuinely helps this work reach more people who care about getting history right. And if there's someone in your life who loves World War II stories told with real facts instead of myth, send them this video, because they will want to see what happens next. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, received the first fragmented reports of the German attack on the evening of December 16th, and unlike several officers around him, he refused to dismiss it as a minor, localized spoiling attack. While General Omar Bradley initially downplayed the offensive scale, Eisenhower's instinct told him this was something far larger and far more dangerous. By December 18th, with the scale of the German push becoming horrifyingly clear, Eisenhower made a decision that would define the entire battle. He committed his only available reserve forces in the theater, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, ordering them to rush toward the threatened sector, with the 101st specifically directed to hold the vital crossroads town of Bastogne no matter the cost. At the same time, Eisenhower understood that holding the line was not enough. Someone needed to counterattack, and counterattack fast, before the German offensive could consolidate its gains and dig in. He summoned his senior commanders, Omar Bradley, Jacob Devers, and George Patton, to an emergency conference the following day in the French city of Verdun, a location chosen partly for its grim symbolism from the previous World War. The atmosphere among Eisenhower's staff in the days leading up to that meeting was grim, almost funereal, with officers privately questioning whether the entire front could hold. Patton, meanwhile, had already been quietly preparing. For weeks, his own intelligence staff at the Third Army had been the only Allied unit correctly predicting a major German buildup to the north, even while other intelligence officers reassured their commanders that nothing serious was brewing. The Verdun meeting convened on December 19, 1944, in a cold, sparse room, with roughly 16 officers and staff members present around a single map table. The mood was heavy until Eisenhower himself set the tone with a line that startled several of the men in the room. He told them plainly that the situation should be regarded as an opportunity for the Allies, not a disaster, because the German army had finally come out from behind its fixed defenses, the Siegfried Line, and exposed itself in open, mobile combat where Allied numbers and mechanized strength could be brought fully to bear. General Strong, the intelligence chief, laid out the grim reality on the map, explaining that German units were already bypassing American resistance at both St. Vith and Bastogne, threatening to drive deep toward the Meuse River and potentially toward Brussels itself. Bradley raised immediate concern about Bastogne specifically, emphasizing its critical road network as the single most important objective in the entire sector. Eisenhower agreed without hesitation that protecting Bastogne had to become the immediate priority of any counterattack. The generals discussed several options, including a deeper strike to cut the German salient off entirely at its base near the German border, but Eisenhower ultimately judged that the more urgent task was strengthening the southern shoulder of the Bulge while driving hard and fast toward Bastogne itself. It was at this point in the meeting that Eisenhower turned his full attention toward the one commander in the room who had spent the previous weeks quietly preparing for exactly this scenario. Eisenhower looked directly at George Patton and asked him a question that, decades later, military historians still cite as one of the most consequential exchanges of the entire war. He asked Patton how long it would take to disengage 6 full divisions of his Third Army, currently locked in active combat along the Saar River front to the south, and pivot them 90 degrees to counterattack north toward Bastogne. For most commanders in that room, the honest answer would have involved days of planning, days of logistics work, days of staff coordination before a single division could move. Patton's answer, by contrast, came almost immediately, and it landed in the room like an electric shock. He told Eisenhower that he could attack the day after tomorrow morning, explaining that his staff already had a fully developed operational order ready, prepared for exactly this contingency, with 3 full divisions positioned to begin moving north within 48 hours. According to multiple witnesses present that day, the effect of that single sentence on the room was almost physical, a current of disbelief and excitement running through officers who, moments earlier, had been bracing for catastrophe. This was not bravado spoken without preparation. Patton's intelligence staff had flagged the danger of a German buildup as early as November, and while First Army commanders to the north dismissed the quiet sector as simply quiet, Patton had ordered contingency plans drawn up in secret, plans built around named axes of attack that his staff could trigger with nothing more than a single coded phrase transmitted by telephone. Eisenhower, however, remained skeptical of moving quite that fast, and his response to Patton has been recorded almost word for word by multiple historians who interviewed officers present that day. He told Patton not to be careless, warning him that if he tried to attack that early, he would not have all 3 divisions properly assembled and would end up committing his forces piecemeal, exposing them to defeat in detail rather than delivering the kind of overwhelming blow the situation demanded. Patton held his ground, insisting his staff truly was ready and that speed itself was the single greatest advantage available to the Allies in that moment, since the Germans would assume, correctly under any normal circumstances, that an American army could not realistically reposition 6 divisions across icy roads in the dead of winter in under a week. After considerable back and forth between the two men, a compromise was reached. Eisenhower agreed to authorize the counterattack, but pushed the launch date slightly later, to December 22, and insisted that Patton commit at least 3 full divisions to the opening assault rather than risk a smaller, faster but weaker thrust. It was a calculated risk on Eisenhower's part as much as Patton's, a decision made by a commander willing to bet heavily on a subordinate's preparation and judgment rather than play it safe with a slower, more conventional buildup. The agreement reached in that room would shortly become one of the most studied logistical feats of the entire Second World War, and frankly, if you're someone who appreciates seeing exactly how high-stakes decisions actually got made instead of the simplified version most people learn in school, that's worth 2 seconds of your time right now to like this video so it reaches more people who feel the same way. The moment the Verdun meeting ended, Patton did not waste a single minute. He walked out of the conference room, found a telephone, and called his own headquarters back at the 3rd Army Command Post. He spoke only 2 words into the receiver, a prearranged code phrase his staff had been waiting for: play ball. Those 2 words instantly triggered a meticulously prepared operational order, mobilizing the 4th Armored Division, the 80th Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division, pulling them out of active combat positions along the Saar and setting them in motion north toward Bastogne. Over the following days, Patton would ultimately reposition 6 full divisions, encompassing both his 3 Corps and 12 Corps, shifting his entire operational focus along a front stretching from Bastogne in the west to Echternach in the east. This was not a small logistical undertaking. More than 133,000 Third Army vehicles were rerouted onto narrow, icy roads, covering an average distance of over 11 miles per vehicle, an enormous coordinated movement executed in the dead of a brutal European winter with minimal advance notice. Patton drove his subordinate commanders relentlessly during this period, urging one corps commander to push forward even close enough to hear enemy gunfire, accepting heavy losses in tanks and men as the unavoidable cost of speed. The weather itself became almost as significant an adversary as the German army, with snow, ice, and dense cloud cover slowing movement and grounding the Allied aircraft that could otherwise have devastated the exposed German columns from above. Patton was acutely aware that clear skies meant air power, and air power meant decisive advantage, so in a moment that has become one of the most retold details of the entire campaign, he ordered his Third Army chaplain to compose a formal prayer specifically requesting fair weather for battle. That prayer was printed and distributed to tens of thousands of soldiers across the Third Army in the days before the counterattack. Whether through coincidence or remarkable timing, the skies began clearing within days, allowing Allied fighter bombers back into the fight against the exposed German spearheads pushing toward the Meuse River. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne itself, the situation had grown desperate. The town was now fully encircled by German forces, defended primarily by the understrength 101st Airborne Division along with scattered armored and artillery units that had managed to fight their way in before the ring closed. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies were dwindling fast, and on December 22, German commanders sent a formal surrender demand to the American defenders inside the perimeter. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, gave a one-word reply that would become one of the most famous responses of the entire war, a blunt and now legendary single word of defiance that needed no further explanation to anyone who heard it. The siege continued, the cold deepened, and outside the perimeter, Patton's divisions were now grinding their way north against fierce and determined German resistance. The attack Patton had promised launched on schedule on December 22, with his 3 Corps driving hard along the Arlon to Bastogne Road, while his 12 Corps pushed simultaneously toward Luxembourg City and the town of Echternach, protecting the right flank of the entire operation. Progress was brutally slow and costly. In the snow on that very first day, 1 battalion of the 4th Armored Division alone lost over 30 tanks to well-positioned German anti-tank guns, a staggering toll that underscored just how dangerous this winter offensive truly was. Patton pushed his corps commanders without mercy, demanding constant forward movement regardless of the weather, regardless of fatigue, regardless of mounting losses, because every additional day the siege of Bastogne continued was another day closer to the garrison running out of ammunition entirely. Reports reaching 3rd Army headquarters from inside the besieged perimeter grew increasingly urgent, with one radio message warning that conditions were becoming critical and pleading for the relief force to maintain maximum possible pressure. Patton, by his own account in private letters and diary entries written during this period, drove himself nearly as hard as he drove his men, visiting frontline units personally, often riding in an open jeep through freezing conditions to check on morale and progress firsthand. On Christmas Day itself, with Bastogne still surrounded and the sound of approaching artillery audible but not yet visible from inside the perimeter, Patton ensured that every soldier in his army received a hot turkey meal despite the chaos of active combat operations, a small gesture that mattered enormously to exhausted troops fighting through the bitter Ardennes winter. The breakthrough finally came on the afternoon of December 26, 1944, 10 days after the German offensive had first shattered the American line. Spearhead elements of the 4th Armored Division, after days of brutal fighting through determined German resistance, finally broke through the encirclement and made physical contact with the defenders inside Bastogne, opening a narrow but vital corridor for reinforcement and resupply. News of the relief spread quickly through Allied headquarters and across the world, instantly becoming one of the most celebrated moments of the entire European campaign. Patton himself, writing to his wife shortly after the breakthrough, called the relief of Bastogne the most brilliant operation his army had performed throughout the entire war, and in his own private judgment, the single outstanding achievement of the conflict to that point. It is worth pausing here to understand exactly what had been accomplished in strictly military terms. In a span of barely 72 hours from the original Verdun Conference, an entire field army of more than 250,000 men, along with hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of vehicles, had disengaged from active combat, pivoted 90 degrees, and launched a coordinated multi-divisional counterattack across icy, unfamiliar terrain in the dead of winter. Military historians have studied this maneuver for decades as one of the most remarkable feats of operational logistics and command confidence in the entire history of mechanized warfare. The siege was broken, but the fighting in the Ardennes was far from finished, and Patton's forces would continue grinding forward for weeks, eventually linking up with Allied units pushing from the north to fully close the bulge by mid-January. The strategic consequences of this single decision extended far beyond the immediate relief of one besieged town. By breaking the southern shoulder of the German offensive and relieving Bastogne, Patton's counterattack helped collapse the entire logic of Hitler's Ardennes gamble, denying German forces the open roads and momentum they desperately needed to reach the Meuse River and threaten Antwerp. Within weeks, German forces across the entire bulge were in full retreat, having suffered irreplaceable losses in tanks, fuel, and experienced troops that Germany could never again replace on the Western Front. Some 19,000 American soldiers died in the broader Battle of the Bulge, a sobering reminder that even the most celebrated operational success in this campaign came at enormous human cost. Eisenhower himself, reflecting later on the decision made at Verdun, would describe his reasoning at the time as a calculated bet that the German breakout from their fixed defensive positions had created a genuine opportunity for the Allies, one that demanded immediate and decisive action rather than caution. The episode cemented Patton's reputation, already controversial after earlier incidents in his career, as arguably the most operationally brilliant field commander the United States Army produced during the entire war. Other senior officers, even those who had clashed with Patton's abrasive personality for years, privately acknowledged that no other commander in the European theater could likely have executed that maneuver with the same speed and confidence. Now here is where the story moves from the battlefield to Washington, and where I owe you complete historical accuracy rather than convenient myth. In December of 1944, Harry Truman was not yet President of the United States. He was Vice President, having been sworn in only 2 months earlier, and Franklin Roosevelt, by deliberate design, kept his vice president almost entirely outside the loop on sensitive military and diplomatic matters. Truman would later describe, with considerable bluntness, just how little operational detail reached his desk during this period, learning major war developments largely through the same newspapers available to ordinary American citizens. It would not be until April of 1945, months after Bastogne had already passed into military legend, that Truman would suddenly inherit the full weight of the presidency, the war, and command authority over men like Eisenhower and Patton. What we do know, documented clearly through Truman's later writings, his presidential decisions, and his public statements once in office, is that he came to deeply respect the kind of commander who could be trusted to act decisively under pressure rather than waiting for perfect information or explicit step-by-step direction from above. As president, Truman would later face his own version of exactly this dilemma, repeatedly choosing between commanders who demanded caution and commanders willing to act on prepared judgment, a tension that defined much of his presidency through Korea and beyond. What makes the Bastogne relief endure as one of the most studied moments in American military history is not simply the scale of the logistical achievement, remarkable as that was. It is the underlying principle the entire episode illustrates so clearly. Patton was able to respond to Eisenhower's question with such confidence not because he was reckless or improvising under pressure, but precisely because he had already done the difficult thinking, the contingency planning, and the staff work weeks before anyone asked him the question at all. By the time Eisenhower posed his question in that cold room in Verdun, Patton was not gambling. He was simply executing a plan he had already built, refined, and kept ready, waiting only for the order to begin. That distinction, between genuine preparation disguised as boldness and actual recklessness, is the real lesson buried inside this story, and it is a distinction that separated Patton from nearly every other commander in that room on December 19, 1944. The relief of Bastogne remains, to this day, one of the most concrete, thoroughly documented examples in modern military history of how decisive leadership, built on prior preparation rather than blind improvisation, can turn what looks like certain disaster into one of the most celebrated victories of an entire war. If this kind of carefully researched, fact-checked military history is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep producing it, and if anything in this story surprised you or taught you something you didn't already know about Bastogne, Eisenhower, Patton, or the chain of command that connected them all the way up to a vice president who, at the time, knew almost nothing about any of it, drop a comment and tell me what stood out to you most, because that's exactly the kind of detail that makes real history more compelling than any legend built around it.